If you're a poor guy in a poor family, you've got 6 kids, and a mullah comes to you and says, "Give me your son," they never say girls, "Give me your son, and I'll educate him, I'll clothe him, I'll feed him for 8 years," you say, okay, maybe he'll get some education. They don't ask too closely what the education will be. They're pleased someone is offering to do it. Now the question is, why has the Pakistani state, which has been in existence for over 60 years, failed to provide a basic educational system for its people? And the reason for that is that it has been governed by venal, corrupt elites, which have been more interested in looting the country's resources and lining their own pockets than doing anything for the people. And that remains a problem today. And it makes no difference whether it's the military, on this level, whether it's the military or civilian, supposedly elected governments in power. I mean, General Musharraf, the last military dictator, who's, written about in the Western media as being very enlightened and all this. Well, I don't know about that. What I do know is he was totally corrupt. Because on a general salary, you cannot afford buying large apartments in Manhattan or overlooking Hyde Park in London. Where has this money come from? And everyone knows where it's come from. And here the contrast with neighboring countries is interesting. I mean, a lot of people in India will tell you, experts and critical experts, that most Indian generals who retire into 2 or 3 bedroom apartments which have been made available to them. Not in Pakistan, where the current commander-in-chief of the army, General Kiani, who came to power a few years ago, already has a huge house in Islamabad. He was obviously preparing to become chief of the army. So it's not just the civilian politicians who are corrupt. This corruption eats the top level of the army too. The civilian politicians, of course, are a disgrace to the country. You have 3 different gangs, and they exchange power regularly. You have the PPP gang, which is currently led by Asif Zardari, who the only reason he's president is because his wife was assassinated. And she took democracy to new levels by bequeathing the party to her family in a written will. As at the very moment she was being praised as the princess of democracy on Western television channels, the will was being read out before the leaders of her party, who assembled like second-rate retainers, and heard the will being read out, in which he said, "My son becomes leader of the party till he comes of age. My husband will be the caretaker president." And so the husband is elected president, one of the most corrupt politicians Pakistan has produced in its entire history. There were 3 cases registered against him in European courts, one in Spain, in Barcelona, one in Geneva, and one in London. All of them mysteriously disappeared. So it's not just Karzai who's corrupt in Afghanistan. We know that. His twin in Islamabad is just as corrupt, if not worse. All they do, they think about is making money. Politics is a means to make money, nothing else. And the people waiting to take over are not as skilled in it, but they're not bad, Nawaz Sharif and his brother. And then there's a 3rd gang based in Gujarat, the Chaudhrys of Gujarat, who serve any government that wants their help, provided they can make a bit on the side. These 3 groupings have dominated civilian politics in Pakistan, while the military dominates military politics and deals with all these groups. Often they work with the military. So you can actually name and shame this elite, which I do in my book. Say who they are, where their wealth came from, and how it continues to grow. So the United States ambassador, Ann W. Patterson, recently, or not recently, but about a year ago, was visited by a European intelligence chief who told me this himself. I can't name him or his country because he made me promise not to name him. So I said, okay, I won't. But he said I was astonished. I went to call on the US ambassador, as every visiting intelligence chief does, because that's where we get a view of what the big power thinks. And she said to me bluntly, we're very happy with Zardari because when we had Musharraf, he would promise us one thing in Washington and come back and do a different thing here. Zardari does whatever we ask him to do. And this guy was totally shocked by the cynicism. I wasn't actually. I said, well, look, why are you shocked? The US Embassy is, the Viceregal Lodge. I mean, they run the country. And so the fact that she's saying it is very significant. So I said, you shouldn't be critical of her for her candor. You should be critical of her for her lack of judgment in thinking this is the guy who's going to do the business for them in Pakistan when he is absolutely despised and loathed by swathes of the population, including half his own party. And half the country believes he organized the assassination of his own wife. I don't believe that, by the way, but I pass it on, that this perception is very strong in Pakistan. Ordinary people will tell you, if you say, do you know who killed Benazir? Of course, there's a layer who always thinks it's everything bad is done by the Americans. But on this occasion, they're completely outnumbered by those who think that Zardari had his wife killed. So, you ask with a straight face, why? Why do you think he would do that? And they say, why? How can you ask? Look where he is. People believe it. They have no proof. I mean, there's circumstantial evidence, but no real proof. But people believe it, which gives you an idea of the extent to which the people have become cynical of their politicians. And this cynicism is dangerous. What surprises me whenever I return to the country is how few people still are attracted to the religious groups. Given this big vacuum, you'd think more would go over, but they don't. They don't trust them. So the question in Pakistan, reimagining Pakistan, for me is quite simple, actually. I think that one honest government which used the money it's getting from the West not to line its own pockets and to shore up its bank accounts abroad, but which used the money to create a social infrastructure for the country that is by the state, not by private companies, by the state, and educational, health, subsidized food, all this could be done. It's not a utopian dream at all. It could be done. The money is there. The money is given by the West. A lot goes on to supplying the army. But still there's enough left over. I mean, how much does it cost to build and create 6 teachers training universities in the country? 6, I think, would do the trick. Just to train teachers, because you have to train people how to teach. That art has been lost in Pakistan. It doesn't cost that much. And people are desperate for it. And numbers of people told me. They said, do you think it's bad? These were poor people, virtually barely literate themselves. They said, do you think it's wrong of us to also think that if we get an education system, that our children should be allowed to learn English? I said, no, it's a very good idea. And they said, but do you think it's anti-Islamic? I said, why? Malaysia has done it. It's a large Muslim country. And English was made compulsory by Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia 30 years ago. He said, whatever you learn, Malaysian or Chinese, you have to speak English, because without knowing English, you can't read all the research which is going on in the West, and you can't develop. And people were amazed when I said that to them in Pakistan. I said, Malaysia can do it and we can't do it, and why shouldn't you learn English? Why should English be a monopoly just of the elite? But the elite preserves and clings to this monopoly like anything. I want to tell you one story because it's very indicative. There's an acquaintance of mine who's a very wealthy furniture dealer. His family has been trading in furniture hundreds of years. He's a single guy, and he told me that once, I would look and my chauffeur would come to drive me somewhere, and this little girl would come out with him and hug him and not want him to go. And I said to him, "How old is this child?" And he said 5 or 6. So he said, I did feel bad. I said, "Where are you sending her to school?" And he said, the chauffeur laughed in my face and said, "Sending her to school? We are poor people." So he said, "Look, I'm prepared to pay for her to be educated. Do you mind?" He said, "No, please." So this guy took the girl with her parents. Her father was driving to a shop, found clothes for her, good clothes, went to the top school in the country, privatized, run just for the kids of the rich. But because they all knew him, they were waiting for him. He rang and said, "I'm coming with this little girl." They said, "Fine." So he introduced. So he said, "How much? I'd like to pay. How long will you educate her? Take for all the period, 8, 10 years. So they were a bit surprised. They said, "Fine. How much will it be?" So he wrote out a massive check, gave it to them. Said, "Here, she will become, the car will bring her to just educate her." Then the headmistress of the school said, "What is the child's name?" So he gave her name. And he said, "Oh, but that's not your name." And he said, "No, she's not my child, but I'm paying for her to be educated." And they said, "Do you mind telling me whose child she is?" And he said, "She's my chauffeur's child." She said, "We're very sorry, we can't take her." Because, this other parents would object that we're taking a chauffeur's daughter. He just freaked, tore up his check and left. So I said, "Well, what did you do?" He said, "I went to a Jesus and Mary convent, a Catholic school, told them what the story was. They took her on. They took her on, said no problem at all, and I built them a new building to teach the kids science. Now, so I just give you that story to show you how depraved this elite is and debased it is, that it can't even permit the poor to be educated. I mean, it lives in a different time, and this has nothing whatsoever to do with religion at all. This is to do with the way that country is run. Now, these are very real problems which are not being sorted out. And one reason there is no pressure from the West to do this, because we have a culture in the West since the 80s, which is, as you know, it's now collapsing, a neoliberal culture, which denies the state the right to do too much anyway. And when everything is being privatized in the Western world, it becomes difficult for them to suggest to countries elsewhere that they should do what the European countries were doing after the Second World War, which is building up social welfare, social democratic systems. That was not permitted by the Washington Consensus, or frowned upon. And we've seen the results now as the crisis hits deeper and deeper. Yesterday Dubai, tomorrow God knows what. So these are the problems that confront Pakistan, which are solvable. And added to that, there is the problem of the war. And if these are not seen together, then you only get a very one-sided and partial view of the country. So it is seen only from the point of view of so-called security needs of the West, most of which are fake anyway. I'll end there.